There are mornings when you wake up not knowing that you are about to live the last day of a life you thought was yours. For me, it began with the faint scent of coffee and a slant of sunlight cutting through the misted glass of the 17th floor. The building belonged to a media company where I had spent 8 years, a place I once believed would always have room for people who stayed honest, worked with care, and understood others with their hearts. My name is Anamaria Goltes, not the kind of name that sticks easily in a world that values speed over depth. But I was never in a rush. I worked in brand communications, specializing in emotional and cultural marketing, the kind that relied not on numbers, but on trust. They called it emotional marketing. I simply called it work. My office was tucked away in a quiet corner, not too close to the boardroom, yet not too far from the strategy department. It was the kind of space where one could listen without being noticed. I was not the face of internal videos or the recipient of quarterly awards, but the long-term clients, the delicate campaigns that looked simple yet carried subtle depth, often had my fingerprints behind the scenes. I worked directly with partners from Japan, Korea, Thailand, and France. I was not just a content lead. I bridged cultures, synchronized communication rhythms, and helped keep empathy alive. People trusted me, or at least they used to. Brandon Cross did not. He was the new director, arriving like a wave that swept away anything that did not belong to the future. Sharp looks, sharper words, and a deck full of promises about digital transformation, automation, and brand renewal. I remember his first day. He did not greet the receptionist, did not nod at the security guard, just walked straight into the lobby as if the company had always been his. I barely looked up from my screen, thinking he would eventually learn the culture before attempting to change it. But I was wrong. Brandon did not learn. He eliminated. Camille was the first to change. She used to be my friend. She once invited me to her daughter's birthday party, once asked for my opinion when helping her brother apply for a scholarship. Now she sat next to Brandon during strategic meetings and avoided eye contact in the hallway. Once the kind-hearted HR director, she had become the cold voice behind announcements about restructuring. One day, when I asked her about the rumors of layoffs, she quietly said, "You should prepare for every possibility. Even if no one mentions your name." I said nothing in return. The all-hands meeting happened on a Monday. Brandon stood in front of the glass-walled conference room, light catching the clean cut of his hair and the gleam of his silver watch. He spoke effortlessly about agility, streamlining, and the need to adapt, then turned to me, mid-speech, and asked with a voice as light as the breeze, "You are Anamaria." "Right," I nodded. "And your current role is chairs shifted slightly." I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "I lead international campaigns, from strategy to content, and I align cultural understanding between us and our East Asian partners. I do more than communications. I protect empathy." Brandon nodded, as if acknowledging what I said, but his eyes were empty. He was not listening. He was scanning, deciding who to keep and who to let go. A week later, I received a calendar invite, no subject, no message, just a blank slot at 9 a.m. I understood. When I entered the room, Brandon and Camille were already seated. A beige folder rested between them in the filtered morning light. They started with soft words about my contributions, then shifted to the reason for letting me go. "Your role no longer aligns with our new direction," Brandon said, trying to sound gentle. "We will be outsourcing cultural and language services. It is more efficient." Camille pushed the folder toward me. Inside were termination papers and a cold breakdown of financial support. I did not argue. I asked only one question. "Are you sure you understand what I actually did for this company?" Brandon shrugged. "You managed partner relations and cross-cultural communications." I did not correct him. Some lessons can only be learned in the silence left behind when the truth is no longer present to explain itself. I left the building that day without crying, but I remember Rachel's eyes, the accountant at the far end of the hall, the only one who dared look directly at me as I walked past. She gave a faint nod, a silent farewell. In the elevator, someone instinctively stepped aside, as if afraid I carried misfortune. Outside, I did not open an umbrella. I let the rain soak into my shoulders, my shirt, down to my spine, letting the end of it all settle deep into memory. Back home, I sat in my old workspace, the one that had served as my late-night bridge to Tokyo, the one still holding thank you notes from Korean clients. Everything remained in place, but I was no longer at the center of it. I was no longer the same Anamaria. I had become a name erased from the org chart, a quiet breath missing from future meetings. That evening, I called my mother, as I always did when I needed grounding, but her voice slowed when she heard I had lost my job. She said, "Maybe you should come home. Start over. You have been chasing feelings for too long. These days, no one cares about feelings anymore." I stayed silent. That was the moment I realized betrayal does not always come from the top. Sometimes, it comes from where you thought love would never turn its back. I hung up. For the first time in years, I did not open my laptop to check emails. I simply sat there, in the dark, surrounded by keepsakes of a trust that no longer belonged to this version of me. There was a strange emptiness in my chest. Not pain, not sorrow, just the quiet passing of something that had once been beautiful. And I thought, if this was the bottom, then no one could drag me down any further. But I did not yet know that somewhere out there, the ones who had forgotten me were already starting to look for me again. The silence after a fall does not feel like I imagined. It is not cold, not suffocating. It is simply quiet. There were no more chimes from project groups, no last-minute messages from the creative team asking me to polish a cultural translation, no midnight briefs arriving with the question of whether a tagline felt touching enough. The things that used to wear me out had suddenly become a luxury. On some mornings, I left the curtains drawn, sat beside a cup of cold coffee, listened to the wind slide through the window gap, and wondered what remains when you are no longer someone in the eyes of others. I did not pity myself. I just learned to see more clearly, to see the feeling of being pushed out of the game by someone who never understood me, to see the way old colleagues, once drained beside me through endless nights, now looked away without a word. Betrayal is not always a stab in the back. Sometimes it is a silent turning away. But I did not stay down for long. There was something inside me that had been shaped over years of meeting deadlines across time zones, of standing between two sides that could not understand each other and being forced to create a third language. It was not strength. It was persistence. One day, I reorganized an old filing cabinet, my hand brushing over sticky notes and handwritten messages from international partners, simple thank you letters that carried more weight than any contract. And I realized that I had never simply done my job. I had been the bridge that kept many relationships intact between the company and the world beyond. Now those bridges were missing me. I began writing again, not job applications, but writing down the values I once believed in, once lived by. I sketched a small consulting model for emotional communication, designed for small to mid-sized businesses still struggling to navigate international markets, where emotion could not be coded and where strategy had to begin with empathy. I had no office, no big startup fund, just an old laptop, some archived emails, and connections that had never truly been broken. I called it tactum, from the Latin word meaning to feel by touch. I wanted what I built to be felt, not just seen. In the beginning, I wrote blog posts, small reflections on cross-cultural communication. I was not trying to sell anything. I simply shared what I had seen, told quietly from the point of view of someone who had stood on many thresholds. A week later, A former regional director I once worked with shared my piece on post-pandemic marketing strategy. 2 weeks after that, a young content company from Saigon reached out, asking if I would consider being their advisor. I sat at my screen, not feeling triumphant, just sensing that someone had knocked on my door, not loudly, but loud enough for me to hear. I said yes. The first Zoom meeting happened on a rainy evening. Their team was young, and someone respectfully called me ma'am. I did not feel old, nor did I feel the need to prove anything. I just listened, then gently explained why their previous campaign had failed. It was not the idea. It was that they forgot to step into the real feelings of their audience. They had looked at the data, but not at the people. When I said that, there was a long silence. Then their team lead gave a soft laugh and said, "So you're actually teaching us emotional marketing for real." I did not deny it. The more I worked, the more I remembered why I once loved this field. More advisory requests followed. A small company in Hanoi planning to expand into Korea. An independent film group needing someone to refine cultural context in their script. I never advertised. Everything came through word of mouth. It was not fast growth, but it was steady. I worked quietly, at my own pace, choosing what to hold on to and what to let go. But not everything went smoothly. There was a client who scheduled 3 meetings and missed them all. Another company asked me to work under a white label model, offering my work under someone else's name. I declined. I would not return to a past where my effort was taken and my name forgotten. Some nights, I stayed up not because of deadlines, but because of a vague fear that I was walking a path no one cared about. And whenever doubt crept in, I would reopen an old email, like the one from Mr. Leung, a Cambodian partner, who once sent me a small silk scarf and a handwritten note saying, "Thank you for never treating us as people who needed to be guided." Words like that were enough to keep me going. One day, I received a message from Alex Meyer. We had once met at an international conference in Bangkok. He was a regional director at a communications consultancy based in Boston. Back then, I had only been seated in the 3rd row, but my short talk had made him reach out to me. His message was brief. "I heard you left Langston. Their loss. If you're free, I'd like to buy you a coffee." I read it 3 times before replying. "I'm free Friday afternoon." We met at a small cafe, the kind with tables by the window and a view of the street. Alex got straight to the point. "I'm rebuilding our international strategy team. I'd like you to advise on some Southeast Asia accounts. Nothing long-term, just to test the fit." I did not answer right away. I needed to know this was not a title trap, a situation where my work would be used without recognition. But Alex added, "I know you're not looking for opportunities. I reached out because I need the way you work." I accepted. From then on, I split my days in 2, mornings for Tactum, afternoons advising for Lawson and Reed. No one knew I was working 2 roles. I did not flaunt it, but I did not hide it either. What mattered most was doing things the way I believed was right. Some days, when I looked in the mirror, I saw that my eyes were no longer clouded like they had been right after I was dismissed. It was not because I had succeeded. It was because I had stood back up, quietly and long enough for pain to no longer be a wound, but to become clarity. Some collapses do not begin with a loud crash. They begin with quiet fractures. I was not intentionally following news about Langston and Rowe anymore, but bits and pieces still found their way to me, like old cuts that had never healed. One day, a former colleague unexpectedly sent me a short news article. It said the company was facing delays in renewing a key strategic contract in Seoul. I skimmed through it without comment. What came to mind instead was a call from last year with Mr. Han, who had once told me they had chosen a long-term partnership because they trusted in genuine understanding, not because of discounts. Back then, I was the one holding that trust. Now, no one was. Other messages began to arrive. From people who had once looked away in the elevator when I left, Rachel sent a short line. They are lost. Everything is a mess. I did not ask for more. But I felt something becoming clearer, that the person who once dismissed me was now paying a price, not because I did anything, but because the truth has a way of surfacing on its own. Rumors spread quickly that Brandon was struggling to manage the international accounts. A few clients from Japan requested a change in point of contact, citing a lack of cultural nuance and sensitivity. I knew exactly what that meant. It was a polite way of expressing deep disappointment. One afternoon, as I was preparing slides for a presentation at Lawson & Reed, Alex came in with a look I had not seen before. He sat down, poured a coffee, and asked, "Do you still have contact with Dejin Media?" I nodded. He paused, then said, "They just pulled out of their 3-year contract with Langston. No official reason, but I heard Langston assigned someone new without even a proper handover." I was not surprised. I simply asked, "Did they mention me?" Alex looked at me with a knowing gaze. "They want someone who understood them before. I think they're asking for you directly." I did not respond right away, but something quiet stirred inside me. Not joy, just a deep awareness that real value does not need to be called by name. It only needs to be remembered at the right time. A week later, word spread that Brandon had canceled an internal meeting at the last minute. The stated reason was health, but a source close to Camille said a major client in Paris had refused to sign, claiming they no longer felt respected by the way things were being handled. I could picture it clearly. Brandon sitting in the meeting room, his eyes flickering as he realized that those who once feared him were now questioning him in silence. No one stood up to confront him. But every small action, every ignored call, every delayed contract was the clearest form of resistance. I kept my own rhythm. Nothing changed on the surface, but day by day, I began receiving more strange messages. A former brand director asked if I was still open to consulting. A creative team in Manila invited me to speak at their conference on emotional marketing. There was an email from Mr. Anling, just one line. "I'm glad to know you're still working. We need people like you." These messages came steadily, not overwhelming, just enough to let me know that when one door shuts in silence, another will open with trust. One Thursday evening, as I was packing up to leave the office, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number, but the prefix was from Langston and Rowe. I did not rush to answer. I let it ring until the 4th cycle before picking up. "Anamaria." A man's voice said, dry and trying to stay composed. "This is Brandon." I said nothing, waiting for him to get to the point. "I know this may come as a surprise, but I think we need to talk." I sat down, my voice neutral. "I'm listening." Brandon inhaled, then went straight to it. "Things are difficult. A few major clients have withdrawn or put contracts on hold. I won't beat around the bush. I think we need you to come back as a consultant or whatever form you find appropriate." I did not respond immediately. The silence stretched. Then I said, "Send a formal proposal. I'll take a look." That night, I felt no anger, no sense of triumph, just something strange, like the wheel had turned back to the beginning. But the circle was no longer intact. I was no longer someone who had been cast out. I was now someone they could not afford to do without. This was not revenge. It was consequence. I sat in the dark, sipping lukewarm tea, thinking of those early days after I was pushed out, and realized that I felt more at peace than I had ever imagined. This story was not finished yet, but the one who once held the handle now saw the blade slipping from his grip. There comes a quiet moment when you realize there is nothing more you need to prepare, not because you feel a surge of confidence, but because every question in your mind has already settled into its answer. I felt that on a Monday morning, stepping into my small office, opening my laptop, checking my inbox, and finding an invitation from a Singaporean partner I once helped through a sensitive communication crisis with just a single carefully worded email. They asked if I would take on the same role again, this time not on behalf of a company, but as myself. No intermediaries, no coordinators, just me. They said they needed someone with long memory and instinct in the right place. I read that phrase over and over, long memory, instinct in the right place. I needed no greater compliment. It turned out the very traits once considered outdated and intangible were now exactly what people came back to when modern systems began to fail. That evening, I printed out a blank sheet of paper and drew 2 columns. On the left, I listed the things I once did out of obligation. On the right, I wrote the things I would do from now on. Under the second column, I wrote clearly, no working under someone else's name, no building legacies for others, no consulting without the freedom to ask questions in return. I needed to protect my space, a space where real value would not be reduced to a line on a slide. I sat with that list for a long time, and when I finally folded it, I knew this was not some strategic roadmap. It was a reminder to live honestly. 3 days later, Brandon sent a new email, this time with a full proposal attached. The content was neat, concise, but clear. They wanted me to return in the role of a special advisor, not publicly, no direct responsibilities, just to help them repair the relationships that had fractured. I was not surprised to see that almost every name on the list was someone I had once worked with directly. A part of me found it almost ironic. They had once believed I could be replaced by spreadsheets and fresh slogans. Now the very relationships they had undervalued were the only things that could keep them from sinking. I did not reply right away. I sent a message requesting a face-to-face meeting, no assistance, no HR department. I did not need anyone to serve as a bridge. I wanted Brandon to look at me in the way he never could before. That morning, I wore a slate blue shirt, buttoned to the collar, neat like the way I always worked. No heavy makeup, no accessories. I did not need a new shell to prove anything. I wanted to walk into that room exactly as I was, original and unapologetically myself. The meeting room had not changed. The smell of pressed wood and the chill of the overhead lights were still there. Brandon stood up when I entered, though I could not tell whether it was politeness or tension. He smiled, but it lacked the confidence of before. I sat down, opened the folder I brought, and said nothing for a few seconds. I wanted him to feel the weight of that silence. He began with an incomplete apology, his voice even, like reading from a script approved in advance. I did not react. I waited until he finished, then finally spoke. I'm not coming back to fix your mistakes. I'm coming back to prove that the thing you dismissed is the very thing that determines whether a company survives. He nodded, slower now, then said, I understand. I need you to restart the conversations with our Asian clients. They no longer listen to me. I looked at him, held the gaze, then replied quietly, I will not lead. I will reconnect, but only under my name. And I reserve the right to refuse any approach I believe compromises the spirit of the work. Brandon did not agree immediately, but he knew there was no alternative. I could see it in the way he rolled his pen between his fingers, as if trying not to drop something important. I left that meeting room not feeling victorious. I simply felt light. Light in the way you feel after tidying up a room you no longer live in, just to make sure it is clean before you close the door for good. That night, I sent out the first few emails. I did not mention Langston and Rowe. I signed with my own name, listed myself as an independent consultant, and ended with a familiar line, looking forward to continuing the conversation we once left unfinished. The replies came faster than I expected. A marketing director in Osaka responded almost instantly, saying they had regretted not being able to continue working with me. and that they would reopen the negotiation table if I returned. A partner in Jakarta replied to an old message from last year, adding a short note. Now I finally have the chance to answer what you once asked. I did not rush to respond to them all. I read every word slowly, not out of excitement, but out of respect. Each time a relationship was renewed, I made a quiet note, not for record keeping, but to acknowledge something personal. These were the fragments I once built, once had taken from me, now returning to their rightful place. Only this time, I was the one holding the map. In the days that followed, I did not think much about Brandon, but I knew he was watching every step I took, from a distance, through reports, through the unusual silence of clients who used to demand weekly updates. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what was happening, a quiet rotation where the balance of power had begun to shift, and I, the name once erased from the org chart, had become the axis on which negotiations could find a way forward. I do not call it revenge. I call it a return without fanfare, without a stage, just the quiet resilience of what I had once planted, now rooted deeply enough to outlast the unfamiliar wind. I am ready now, not to reclaim what was lost, but to rebuild with what still remains. And I know that from this point on, the story is no longer about the old company or those who once hurt me. The story now is just this: how to never lose myself again. Some comebacks do not need applause, nor do they require anyone to say your name out loud. They are quiet, like someone returning to a familiar place, not to reclaim what was lost, but to gather the parts that had been left behind. I did not walk back into Langston and Row with a sense of vengeance. I brought with me a task list, a cup of tea in an old thermos, and a calmness I never had in the past. I did not sit in the same room as Brandon, nor did I join internal meetings. They told me I only needed to restore links with the international partners, but they did not realize that each call I made, each name I reached out to, slowly shifted the balance of power away from them, quietly and without notice. My mornings often began with short emails, sent not from a corporate domain, but from a personal address. I did not use a formal title. I signed only my name with a simple line: I would like to continue a conversation we left unfinished. And strangely, most of the people I had once worked with responded. No hesitation, no guarded words, just gentle replies like, "We should reconnect." I spoke little during these conversations. I asked questions, I listened, and I reminded them of things they had once shared, but that no one remembered to ask about anymore. A brand director in Korea, who had once cut ties citing a lack of empathy in the messaging, now asked me to revise their entire new strategy. A partner in Thailand, who had gone silent for 6 months, suddenly sent back a detailed report after I wrote one line in an email: "I still remember how you like to be heard." Those small details, seemingly insignificant, were the threads that mended broken trust. For 3 months, I worked like a shadow. No one mentioned me in review meetings. My name did not appear in any internal reports, yet contracts were being renewed. Clients who had walked away began to return. Partners who once declined meetings now agreed to talk again. Brandon did not understand what was changing, but he knew something was happening. I saw it in how he started avoiding my eyes when we passed each other in the hallway. He no longer made hasty decisions, no longer called out names to direct orders. He stepped back, spoke less, and on some days I saw him standing alone by the window, looking out at the rain as if waiting for an answer that would never come from a report. One late afternoon, as I was preparing to leave the office, Camille knocked on the door. She stepped in slowly, holding a thin folder in her hands. She did not look at me for long, only said, "I want to give you the summary report from the accounts you handled. The board wanted to thank you." I took it, nodded. She paused, then added, "I know I didn't stand by you back then. I know that can't change anything. But I want you to know, I don't believe what Brandon says anymore. I stayed quiet. Not to forgive, not to blame, just because I did not need an apology to keep moving forward. I had already moved. By the 4th month, I received a formal offer from Lawson and Reed, this time not as a consultant, but as a strategic partner. They wanted me to lead a dedicated team focused on sustainable relationships across Asia. I did not decline, but I had conditions. I would only accept if I had full authority to choose my team. I needed people who were not only competent, but who could listen, not just those who could sell, but those who understood respect. Alex agreed, and when I signed the contract, I did not feel like I was making a comeback. I felt like I was stepping into a fuller version of myself, not to prove anything, just to continue in the way I believed was right. No one knew it was my last day at Langston & Rowe in the role of advisor. I walked out of the building like a familiar guest. No farewells, no one asking me to stay, and somehow that made me feel lighter. I did not need a formal goodbye. I only needed to know that I had done my part. Nothing more, nothing less. I left behind a detailed guide on how to maintain each client relationship, including handwritten notes like, do not send emails on Mondays. They consider it impolite, or make sure to spell the representative's name correctly. They once took offense at a typo. These things were not in any process document, yet they were the very reasons people choose to stay or leave. Brandon did not say goodbye, but a week later, I heard he had submitted his resignation. The official reason was pressure from unmet transformation goals. No one said more, but I knew it was the result of quiet losses, not because I wanted him to fall, but because he had chosen a path that left no room for trust. And once trust is broken, no one needs to raise their voice. Silence is enough to make everything collapse. I no longer follow news about Langston, not out of resentment. I simply no longer need to look back. I am rebuilding everything, not from wounds, but from the pieces I quietly preserved while no one was watching. I drink tea more often than coffee. I write more than I speak. I listen more than I debate. I am not a success story in the way people usually define it, but I know I have taken revenge through success, in a way no one can deny, not by reclaiming a title, but by becoming someone who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. And there was one morning when sunlight tilted through the window of my new office, and I sat looking at a project list in front of me. I found myself wondering, not aloud, not with doubt, just softly like a quiet current. Perhaps the one thing no one can ever take away from a person is how they choose to hold on to their own heart in the middle of the storm.